Hi, folks. Robert Lowell Goller here. Thanks for joining me for our weekly chat on local history. This week's idea comes from the newspaper article that I wrote most recently. As many of you know, I do a monthly newspaper column in the East Aurora Advertiser. And I had heard about this idea, or this idea came into my head back in the fall, when one of the historians, the national historians, a lot of you know her, Heather Cox Richardson, had posted about November 18th, 1883. And a lot of times when I read about something that's happened nationally, or even internationally, I if it could pertain to our local communities, East Aurora or any hometown, I try to dig into the local newspapers, local documents that we have to see how that national event impacted our local area. And this was a perfect example. And when I read about it on her, she does a daily newsletter, and she had written about it back in November. Uh, and when I first read about it, I thought I put it sort of on the back burner. And as we were coming closer to daylight saving time, which will be this weekend, I was thinking, oh, this will be the perfect time to write about it. So I did some research about it. And in fact, I found a lot more in the local newspapers than I had anticipated. So, what happened, and Heather Cox Richardson talks about this being a pivotal moment in our nation's history. And it's quite interesting that it's such a big pivotal moment that we kind of take for granted today, as it relates to time and how we keep time, and how our economy sort of really kind of switched in 1883, based simply off the fact of we had a new time system, and it's very fascinating. So, what happened on November 18th, 1883? Well, in the early 1800s, it really wasn't important for every community to have the exact same time, to have a standardized time. So one town could have one time, and another town very nearby could have a completely different time. And what happened is each town came up with its own time based off the position of the sun, natural time. And so East Aurora it could be noon in East Aurora, and it would be 12:04 in Batavia, and just based off of the position of the sun. And you would have someone in a local town who would keep the time. And I'll talk about that in a bit, because I learned through the research, I learned a lot about how local towns operated, and or I had heard about it and I had forgotten about it, and this brought it back up. And in each town, there would be a timekeeper. And the one thing that I did learn was that your local jeweler, your jewelry store owner, would have been the local timekeeper, because they sold the watches and they would set the watches, and you would go in, and so today we have this phone that keeps the actual time on it for us. But back then they didn't have that. So each town would have somebody who would look at the sun and figure out figure out what the time would be. Unfortunately, this was not very precise. And you didn't have a scientist in each town measuring the sun, and so it was imperfect. So when this was no big deal. In the early days, each town could have its own time, and towns were fairly secluded, isolated from one another. And if you were traveling from one town to another, you would arrive, you would find out what the time was, and lived by that time until you went back home, and then you lived on that time. Well, when railroads came along, it became much more important for schedules to stay on schedule. And so, obviously, the railroads relied on people knowing when the train was going to arrive, when the train was going to leave. And so they came up with this system in the mid 1800s to have railroad time. And they would, a bunch of railroads would create their own time systems based on the railroad lines that they were on. So, for instance, East Aurora would have been on Buffalo time. But the system worked in theory would work great. However, there were more than 50, and by some counts even more than that, different time zones. And it got really confusing. And to make matters worse, different railroads adopted different times, often for the same city. And so you could have a case, say in Buffalo, I'm just making that up, but in Buffalo where you were, say, served by three different railroads at the terminal, at the railroad station in a city, and each railroad would adopt a different time. So one would have Buffalo on New York time, another would have it on Cleveland time. And so you had to figure out, as a passenger, figure out what railroad you were taking and what time they were using. And then to make even matters worse, when you were going somewhere, you had to figure out what time you were supposed to be on in the new in your destination. It got really confusing. And so the federal government was actually going to step in because so many people were missing their trains, but also there was a safety element to this. You could have train crashes because different trains run different times. And so the federal government had threatened, or at least the railroads felt that the federal government might threaten, to institute a standard time system. So the railroads got together in October of 1883 and did it on their own. And this was Canadian railroad companies and American railroad companies. And they adopted this standard time zone. And one of the things that I learned was that we still call it standard time today, the time that we are on now, because of the term was used back in 1883 to standardize all the different times that were happening in various towns and on railroad companies throughout the country, to standardize the time, and we still call it standard time. So that's where it originated. The railroads had used this, the system had been developed by meteorologists and people before that to predict the weather and actually document the weather. They needed a standardized time system. So the time zones were born in 1883 with the railroads standardized, and they had 5 different zones. And what they did is they took a time, natural time, sun time, along a line, a longitude line, and then everybody in that time zone would adopt that time along that longitude line. So actually here in East Aurora and in Buffalo, we were along the 75th meridian, which would have gone near Philadelphia. So the railroads said, in adopting this resolution in October, that in a month, which blew my mind, that this could all be put into place within a month. In mid-October, they were adopting this new system in Chicago. They had a big meeting in Chicago, and I know by November 18th they had been instituting it. I can't imagine today, even with all our technology and our communication, that we would do it within a month. But so what was going to happen is at noon on Sunday, November 18th of 1883, if you worked for the railroads, or if you were a jeweler in a town, the person with the watch, and here in East Aurora, which I found interesting, is that Frank Kelsey's Jewelers, those of you who have lived here a while remember that as a store, a jewelry store on Main Street. It's now Ron Jewelers. Mr. Kelsey opened his jewelry store on Main Street in the same location that it is today, next to Vidler's. That he opened it just a few years before this happened. So I can't find documentation anywhere, but there is no doubt in my mind that he would have been one of the people standing at the telegraph station. And what they did is the telegraph companies stopped all communication over the telegraph lines around noon on November 18th, 1883, in order to make space for a signal to tell everyone exactly when the new noon would be. Well, this meant something different in different places. The day became known as the day of 2 noons, because in New York City they actually stopped their clocks for 4 minutes, and actually it was a little more precise. I got a little cheeky in the article. Scientifically precise, 3 minutes and 58.38 seconds is how long they stopped the clocks in New York City. However, because they were on the other side of that meridian line, we being on this side of the line, we actually had to jump ahead by about 16 minutes, or 15 minutes and 18.8 seconds. So we had to jump ahead. So we theoretically, at noon on November 18th of 1883, lost 15 minutes and 18.8 seconds and skipped over the first around 16 minutes of the afternoon on that day. So New York City fell back, and we sprung forward in order to meet in the middle along that 75th meridian, which became the new Eastern Time. And then of course Central had its own time, Mountain and Pacific. That's when those time zones were born, is in 1883. The big problem was it was voluntary. So the railroads instituted this, but not all railroads had said they were going to do it. There was actually a few in the Chicago area that said they weren't going to do it. You had cities and towns that were actually voting against it. And one of the more interesting arguments against standardizing time and not going by the sun time in your particular location was because we should not be messing with God's time. God created natural time, and we shouldn't be messing with it. And so that was one of the arguments against it. Some other cities, like Detroit for a little while, and Chicago, were upset that they were really close to the boundary line between, say, Eastern and Central. So when you're close to the line, ask anybody in Indiana, friends that I have that live in areas where the time zone line between two different time zones is, you have to keep track of two different times. And you also had the biggest variation from the natural time. So if you were closest to the eastern central boundary, you would have had to change your watch more drastically from natural time. So all these things I learned. So today, it kind of put in perspective how we sometimes argue about daylight saving time and whether or not we should be doing it. We are on standard time now. So this is the time that we are on now over the winter time, is the time that the railroads settled on. Daylight saving time, that came around in World War I. So one of the things that kind of dawned on me as I was reading all the old newspaper articles, the East Aurora Advertiser, some newspapers in Batavia area, and that's how I figured out where our time zones. I couldn't find a handy dandy map of time zone, like the time zones before 1883. So I had to go through like cities like Batavia and Rochester and some towns there to figure out that they were actually on New York time before 1883, and we were on Buffalo time. So yeah, Buffalo, we were about 20 minutes different from New York City, but we in East Aurora and in Buffalo were about 20 minutes different from Batavia, just a few miles down the road, because they went with New York time, just because of the way the railroads did it. So the standardized times tried to get rid of that. However, it was voluntary, so you still had some cities that wouldn't do it. Detroit actually didn't do it until after 1900, go to standard time. They kept their own local time for many years. Then the federal government stepped in and they actually mandated these time zones. But that didn't come along for years. So I will put a link to the article from the East Aurora Advertiser in the comment section, so you can read all these details. But and of course that'll be in a book that I'll be writing, putting together a series of books, so it'll be on there. But I found it interesting that these folks, they were very nervous about switching the time. And I thought, well, what, at first I'm like, well, we do it now all the time, and we do argue today about it. And if you want to search for my thoughts on daylight saving time from a historical perspective, you can just search through the Facebook page or YouTube channel. Just search for daylight saving time. I think it was one of the first videos I ever did when I started doing this project. There is a good reason that we do daylight saving time, and I'll let you watch that video if you want to watch it. But trying to get into the head of people living in East Aurora in 1883, they had never changed their clocks. They had never sprung forward or fallen back. That was a totally foreign concept for them. Today we just do it twice a year, and we don't really even think anything of it. But that was a huge deal back then. people living here did not have that concept. The concept that one morning you wake up and the sun comes up at one time, and then the next morning it comes up 16 minutes later or 16 minutes earlier, they couldn't wrap their head around it. And the newspaper articles actually talked about that, which I found very interesting. And for several weeks, it took some time to adjust. There were clocks in Buffalo that weren't updated, so the Buffalo newspapers would talk about which clock towers had the correct time and which ones didn't. They actually ran lists in the paper. The East Aurora Advertiser actually talked about there were organizations, churches in town that they actually in their advertisement said that it was standard, the new standard time, the time that they were giving you, because it was people had to get used to it a little bit. One of the things that was, as I say, that it took them a while to get used to, it was a foreign concept. People thought it was going to be a lot worse than it was. I kind of think of it like the Y2K thing that happened with us in 2000. That the build-up to this whole thing was a lot bigger than the actual event. People actually were expecting everything to fall apart, and the newspaper articles were saying, well, no, it really was in New York City. Everyone showed up and was, expecting a disaster. But it ended up being hardly anything. The clock stopped for 4 minutes, and then they started up again. No big deal. And so people were making a bigger deal out of it ahead of time. But again, I thought it was fascinating that within a month, this whole plan was put into place. Another interesting thing, and I think it's serendipitous or just a coincidence, that the first passenger train to come through the hamlet of West Falls, through the new train company that went through there, happened the exact same week. Actually, I think it was the day after the new time went in, and first train came through West Falls. So that was an interesting timing, given the fact that the railroads were so important to this whole thing. So I did learn a lot as I was researching this, and I thought it was interesting. Heather Cox Richardson talks about how this event, how today we live by time zones. We just know California is going to be 3 hours behind us. But that concept was very new, and it revolutionized how the economy worked, how the trains worked. So I invite you to read more about that. And you can, if you want to look up her Facebook page, you can search for standard time, and her article will pop up about it. But it is very fascinating. But again, a national, international, actually, if you consider that Canada joined with us, and then of course it became a worldwide thing. And other countries had done it earlier too with these standard time zones. But something that was instituted on a national or international basis, really affecting how we operate here in East Aurora, that we are actually about 16 minutes off of when we're on standard time, 16 minutes off the sun time, what we should be if we were keeping track of our time by the sun. We are 16 minutes off from that. And today we don't even think about it that way, that our natural time does not match the standard time, because we've just gotten so used to it. So this was someone had asked me a couple weeks ago, how do you come up with all these ideas? And it's just, you bring me ideas, chatting. I happen across things when I'm reading the newspapers. And then in this case, it was Heather Cox Richardson, one of the historians that I read, who was talking about, obviously she was not talking about East Aurora, but talking about a national issue. And I just was thinking, oh, how did East Aurora respond to this? So that's how I came up with this idea. So again, thank you for joining me for our weekly chats about local history. Keep the ideas coming. I really appreciate it. Either put them in the comments or send me a private message as you do. Again, I am Robert Lowell Goller. I am the town and village historian, but these videos and a lot of my research are not officially connected to my duties as town and village historian. Again, thank you for keeping history alive, and we'll see you next time. Take care.